The air in the Florida Everglades didn't just hang. It pressed against the skin like a wet, feverish wool blanket. For Elias Thorne, this oppressive atmosphere was a sanctuary, a place where the world forgot him, and he could attempt to forget the man he used to be. He lived in a weathered shack on the edge of the brackish water, his days spent tracking gators and his nights haunted by a silence of his own making. A once celebrated herpetologist, he was now a shadow, a man whose name was whispered in academic circles as a cautionary tale of brilliance undone by a single moment of paralyzing cowardice. The memory always started with the smell of cedar bedding and the clinical hum of UV lights. 10 years ago, Elias stood before a glass enclosure, his hands steady until the moment they failed him. His mentor, a giant in venom research, had been attempting a delicate extraction from a massive king cobra. The serpent lashed out with impossible speed, its hood flaring like a crown of death. Elias had the safety snare in his grip. He had the opportunity to pin the beast and save the man he loved like a father. But he had frozen. That split second of hesitation allowed the fangs to find his mentor's forearm. The scream still echoed in Elias's dreams, followed by the agonizing decline of the man who taught him everything. Elias survived, but his soul perished in that lab. Now, a decade later, a record-breaking heat wave hit the small town of Blackwater Creek. The sun turned the humidity into a weapon, baking the earth until it cracked. Alligators moved into residential pools, and the local birds had stopped singing, replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness. The local wildlife was acting out of desperation, but something far older was stirring beneath the limestone shelf of the aquifer, awakened by the heat. A few miles away, a construction crew was clearing land for a new bypass. The heavy drills bit deep into the earth, fracturing a subterranean cavern sealed for millennia. As the dust settled, the workers felt a vibration that didn't come from their machinery. They had unearthed an ancient nesting ground of a species thought to be extinct since the last ice age, the Titan rattle. The site foreman, a man named Miller, was the first to realize something was wrong. He had stepped away to inspect a strange, sinkhole-like opening near the excavators. When his crew went to find him, Miller was missing. All that remained was a shredded, high-visibility vest tossed into the sawgrass and a thick, viscous trail of translucent slime that smelled of old copper and decay. Elias found the first clue of the disaster in his own backyard. While checking his rain barrels, he tripped over something massive. It looked like a discarded plastic tarp until he touched the surface. It was a shed skin, stretching from his porch into the mangroves. He measured it with his eyes, his heart hammering. It was over 30 feet long. The scales were the size of dinner plates, keeled and sharp enough to draw blood. The nightmare he thought was buried in history was breathing in his swamp. A dust cloud signaled the arrival of a battered cruiser. The local sheriff, Elias's childhood friend, stepped out looking haggard. He spoke of moving shadows in the grass and pets vanishing in daylight. He begged Elias for help as reports multiplied. People are terrified, Elias. They say the ground is shifting. Elias realized the snakes weren't just hunting. They were reclaiming their ancestral territory. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias stood in his kitchen, the floorboards creaking. Suddenly, a bone-chilling rattle, deep and resonant, vibrated through his boots. It wasn't coming from the yard. It was coming from directly beneath his floorboards. He realized then that he was no longer safe within his own isolated marshland sanctuary. Elias didn't wait for the floorboards to give way beneath his feet. He grabbed his worn canvas bag, the heavy steel of his professional hooks clanking together like a funeral knell. As he burst through his front door, the Everglades looked transformed. The moonlight didn't reflect off the water. It was absorbed by the dark, undulating bodies of serpents crossing the road in a massive, synchronized migration. Blackwater Creek was already descending into a cacophony of sirens and screams. The drainage systems, designed to whisk away the swamp's overflow, had become high-speed tunnels for the Titan rattles. By the time Elias reached the town square, the main bridge had been blocked by a pile of prehistoric scales and muscle, effectively cutting the residents off from the outside world. The heat wave had turned the town into a massive incubator, and the ancient predators were taking full advantage of the humid darkness. At the temporary command center, Elias was met with the sheriff's hollow eyes and the sharp, piercing gaze of Sarah, a journalist whose career had been built on dissecting academic failures. "You," she spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "Your papers on the aquifer were the reason the developers dug so deep. You knew they were there, and you let them dig for a bypass." Elias didn't defend himself. He couldn't. His hands were shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets to hide the tremors. The ophidiophobia he had suppressed for a decade was clawing at his throat. Every shadow looked like a striking coil. Every rustle of the wind sounded like the rhythmic rattle that had ended his mentor's life 10 years ago. The situation turned critical as reports came in from the local high school gym, where dozens of survivors were trapped. The snakes had surrounded the building, drawn to the collective body heat of the panicked crowd. Elias took the lead, his scientific mind fighting a brutal war against his instinct to flee. Inside the gym's pitch-black corridors, the air was thick with the smell of musk and old earth. "Stay behind me," Elias whispered to the small group, including a skeptical and terrified Sarah. "They see the heat of your blood. Move slowly. Do not breathe too fast." Using his thermal imaging scope, he navigated the hallway, guiding them through cold zones created by the building's heavy-duty air conditioning. It was a macabre dance, stepping over thick, scaly bodies that ignored them only because Elias knew exactly how to mask their presence. As they reached the exit, the sheriff received a desperate radio transmission. The town's nursery, a building with heavy-duty boilers, had become the primary nest for the alpha female, drawn there by the concentrated heat and humidity of the building's central systems. Sarah's face went ghostly white. "My brother?" she gasped. "Toby is still in the daycare. He was at the late-night creche." The mission was no longer about survival. It was a race against a predatory maternal instinct that hadn't been seen on Earth for 10,000 years. When they arrived at the nursery, the scent hit Elias like a physical blow. It was the smell of the lab, copper, rot, and the sharp tang of high-potency neurotoxin. He leaned against the brick wall, his chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack threatened to paralyze him. He could almost feel the king cobra's eyes on him again, watching his fatal hesitation. Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip bruising. "Don't you dare freeze now, Thorn. Not again. My brother is in there." Steeling himself, Elias attempted to use an ultrasonic frequency device he'd built to repel smaller rattlesnakes. He hoped the high-pitched vibration would drive the Titan rattles back into the sewers. But as he activated the switch, the result was catastrophic. The ancient creatures didn't flee, they vibrated in resonance, their own rattles joining the frequency in a deafening rhythmic roar. The sound shattered windows and sent the survivors scattering into the dark, labyrinthine basement. In the chaos, Elias was separated from the group. He stumbled into the sweltering heat of the boiler room, his heart hammering against his ribs. There, draped over the central heating unit like a nightmare of obsidian, was the Alpha. She was beautiful and terrible, her head the size of a shovel. Elias reached for his capture pole, but as he moved, a smaller juvenile snake lunged from the pipes above. He swung the pole to deflect it, and the carbon fiber shaft snapped with a sickening crack. He stood there, unarmed, staring into the slit-pupiled eyes of a prehistoric goddess of death. The broken capture pole clattered against the floor, the sound echoing like a finality in the humid boiler room. Elias stared into the Alpha's eyes, pools of prehistoric malice reflecting the pilot lights. He could feel his mentor's ghost beside him, the memory of that laboratory accident 10 years ago now a choice, not a burden. He would not let hesitation define him again. Slowly, his fingers brushed against a discarded rag soaked in industrial grease. He wrapped it around a metal rod and reached into the boiler's blue flame. The torch flared to life, casting long shadows of the serpent across the peeling walls. The Alpha recoiled, its hood spreading like a dark sail. It hissed, vibrating directly in the marrow of Elias's bones. He remembered the ritual of the marsh tribes he had witnessed in his youth, a dance of dominance and stillness. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. As the Alpha surged forward, its massive head stopping just inches from his face, Elias held the torch steady. The snake's tongue flicked, tasting the heat of his sweat and the ozone of his fear. In that moment of absolute stillness, Elias realized his hesitation had never been about the snakes, but his refusal to accept the wild, unpredictable nature of the world. He was no longer a hermit hiding from ghosts. He was a man reclaiming his place. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a small hand clutching the edge of a steel cabinet. Toby was there, trembling and silent. To save the boy, Elias had to become the prey. He began to back away, tapping the metal rod against the pressurized steam pipes that lined the ceiling. The Alpha followed, its rhythmic rattle intensifying as it prepared to strike. Elias led the gargantuan beast toward the primary release valve, the boiler's boiling heart. As the serpent coiled for its final lunge, Elias threw the torch into the Alpha's face and yanked the lever. A roar of superheated steam erupted from the pipes, white and blinding. The Alpha thrashed in the sudden, scalding mist. In the confusion, Elias lunged for the cabinet, grabbing Toby and shielding him with his own body. But the basement held more than just the Alpha. As they neared the exit, the juvenile snake dropped from the shadows. It struck with lightning speed, its fangs sinking deep into Elias's forearm. He didn't scream. He simply tightly gripped Toby and stumbled out into the hallway as the sheriff and Sarah arrived. Elias collapsed, neurotoxin crawling toward his heart. "The bag," he wheezed, pointing toward his discarded canvas pack. Inside, tucked in a temperature-controlled sleeve, was research. Sarah fumbled with the vial. The experimental antivenom Elias had synthesized from the species haunting him was ready. As the needle pierced his skin, the world began to blur into a soft, quiet gray. Weeks later, the heat wave finally broke, replaced by rain. The town of Blackwater Creek was quiet again, though the scars of the night remained in the boarded-up windows and reinforced grates. The Titan rattles had been driven back into the deep subterranean aquifers, their nesting ground sealed with tons of reinforced concrete. Elias didn't stay in the hospital long. He returned to his home in the marsh, but the boards on his porch no longer groaned with the weight of isolation. He had become a hero to the people he once shunned, a bridge between the civilized world and the wild swamp. He sat on his porch, the sheriff's badge gleaming on a nearby table as a gift of gratitude. Elias looked out over the sawgrass, no longer afraid of the shadows. He knew that fear was just a predator that fed on silence. Far off in the distance, a faint, rhythmic sound echoed through the mangroves. It was a final, ghostly rattle. Nature was still there, keeping its secrets. But for the first time in a decade, Elias was ready